Donald Trump walked into the hearing that day radiating his usual confidence, the kind of swagger that suggested he had already written the ending before the story began. He was at ease in the spotlight, accustomed to turning these political stages into his own personal arena. For a while, it looked like business as usual. He railed about immigration, hammered his talking points, and lobbed insults the way he always did, loud, aggressive, and designed to leave his opponents rattled. His base in the room smirked along, nodding, almost waiting for his signature punchline that would sting someone else. For Trump, this was routine. Dominate the stage, belittle rivals, and twist the narrative into a spectacle. But what he didn't realize was that this time, the script would be rewritten, not by him, but by someone sitting only a few feet away. Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't new to these kinds of exchanges. She had witnessed Trump's tactics enough times to know exactly how he operated. The bullying, the grandstanding, the way he weaponized jokes to distract from substance. None of it was surprising. She let him run his course, taking notes as he paced through his talking points, his voice booming and his hands slicing the air with exaggerated gestures. Crockett was quiet, calm, measured, and patient. Timing mattered, and she was waiting. The air in the chamber was heavy, almost thick, as if everyone sensed that tension was simmering beneath the polished wood and the bright lights. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, and aides whispered hurriedly to one another. The hearing was supposed to focus on immigration policy, but Trump had other ideas. He wanted to score points, grab headlines, and make himself the center of the story, as always. His voice carried like it had countless times before, proclaiming that America was under siege, that the border was crumbling, that the other side was weak. But then, instead of sticking to policy, he took a sudden detour. Leaning into his microphone, Trump smirked and delivered a line that sliced through the chamber like a blade. Maybe some of you should worry about deporting your own kids before you try to lecture me. The words landed with a thud. Ugly, personal, and jarring. At first, there was stunned silence. Then came the scattered reactions. An uneasy chuckle from one corner, a sharp gasp from another, whispers darting like sparks through the room. Even for Trump, who had built a career on cutting below the belt, this was a new kind of low. He wasn't talking about policy anymore. He was dragging families into it. For a second, Trump mistook that silence for victory. He leaned back, pleased with himself, as though he had landed the knockout blow. But he hadn't realized he had just lit a fuse. Crockett, who had been sitting steady until then, set her pen down deliberately, her gaze sharpening as she looked straight at him. Without raising her voice, without theatrics, she leaned forward into her microphone, and with calm precision, she struck. "Mr. Trump," she said, her tone even but cutting, "if you truly believe children should be deported, then by your own logic, wouldn't your family be first in line?" The words detonated instantly. A wave of gasps swept the chamber. Aides fumbled with their papers. Reporters' pens scratched frantically across notepads, and staffers glanced at each other in disbelief. Some people froze in their seats as if they had just witnessed a car crash in slow motion. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric, thick with the realization that something unprecedented had just been said out loud, on record, in front of the cameras. Trump's face faltered. For a fleeting moment, the mask cracked, his jaw slackened, his eyes narrowed, and the smug grin he had worn so easily moments before evaporated. He was used to being the one on the attack, the one dealing out humiliation. But now the punch had been turned back on him, and it landed with surgical precision. He had thrown his usual insult expecting it to scatter his opponents. Instead, it boomeranged, sharper and heavier than when it left his mouth. Crockett didn't stop there. She squared her shoulders, locked eyes with him, and drove the point home. This is exactly why Americans are exhausted by your hypocrisy. Families deserve respect, not to be turned into props for your insults. Real leadership doesn't treat children like weapons in a political game. And that was the moment. The one that would ricochet across social media, dominate news cycles, and ignite endless debates in living rooms, news studios, and late-night talk shows. Within an hour, clips of the exchange would be everywhere, replayed, dissected, and shared millions of times. But inside the room, in that first breathless silence after Crockett's words landed, everyone knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The shift was palpable. Trump, who had walked in as the loudest, most dominant figure in the chamber, suddenly felt diminished. Even his allies looked unsettled, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, unsure whether to defend him or sit in silence. Those who had been smirking minutes earlier now avoided eye contact. The power dynamic had tilted, however briefly, away from him. What made the moment even more devastating was Crockett's delivery. She didn't raise her voice or shout over him. She didn't try to match his bluster with bluster of her own. Instead, she wielded restraint like a weapon, slicing through his bombast with clarity and composure. It was the kind of response that didn't just rebut an insult. It exposed the cruelty at its core. The irony was brutal. Trump had tried to make children the punchline of his attack, but Crockett's counter turned that cruelty back onto him. Suddenly, the joke wasn't funny. It was grotesque, and it belonged to him. The chamber felt it. The viewers at home felt it. And most of all, Trump felt it. By the time the hearing wrapped up, the narrative was already out of his hands. Reporters were rushing to file stories. Staffers were texting furiously, and pundits on both sides were preparing to spin the exchange. But no amount of spin could erase what had happened. For once, Trump had been stopped mid-charge, not with noise, but with a truth so sharp it silenced the room. To understand why it mattered so much, you had to rewind. This wasn't just an off-the-cuff quip that happened to go viral. It was the culmination of years of tension, months of political battles, and weeks of escalating rhetoric. Trump had turned hearings into theater long before that day, using them as stages for his combative style. But Crockett wasn't playing along. She had seen the pattern, knew the playbook, and decided she wouldn't be steamrolled. When Trump shifted from talking about border security to mocking people's children, he crossed a line. And Crockett, representing families who lived in constant fear of those policies, wasn't going to let it slide. She carried with her the voices of parents who worked tirelessly to provide for their kids, children who worried about being torn from their communities, and families who bore the weight of being reduced to political talking points. Trump's insult wasn't abstract to her. It was personal, not for herself, but for the people she represented. That was what gave her words such force. They weren't just a clever clapback. They were rooted in the lived reality of the people who bore the brunt of his rhetoric. And when she turned his insult around, it exposed more than hypocrisy. It revealed the emptiness of his cruelty. The moment now lives on, not just as a viral clip, but as a reminder that even the loudest, most dominant figures can be checked when confronted with courage and clarity. Trump walked into that chamber expecting to control the narrative. Instead, he lost it in a single sentence. And Jasmine Crockett, calm and resolute, etched her name into that story as the one who dared to turn his weapon back on him and leave him stunned in front of the entire nation. The tension inside the hearing chamber was already thick when Representative Jasmine Crockett leaned into her microphone, her eyes locked on Donald Trump. The room, which had been buzzing only moments earlier, suddenly froze into silence. With a voice that cut like tempered steel, she spoke slowly, deliberately, every word sharpened to hit its mark. "Mr. Trump," she said, "if deporting children is really the standard you want to set, then shouldn't you be the very first in line? After all, you yourself have cast doubt on whether your own son would even meet your definition." The air shifted immediately, as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the building. The response wasn't fragmented. It came as a collective jolt. Gasps rippled through the chamber, not just from one side, but from every corner. Heads turned swiftly, some with widened eyes, others with jaws hanging open in disbelief. Reporters nearly dropped their devices in their scramble to capture the moment, fingers flying across keyboards while cameras tilted forward to catch every flicker of expression. It was one of those instances where you could sense history being written in real time. Trump, who had been riding high only minutes earlier, faltered. A flicker crossed his face. Confusion, disbelief, and a flash of anger all tangled together. He was used to swinging the hardest punch in the room, not being struck with the same kind of blow he so often hurled at others. His trademark smirk twitched, slipped, and when he tried to chuckle, the sound came out hollow, brittle. But Crockett wasn't finished. She pressed on, her voice slicing through the anxious whispers like a scalpel. "This is the heart of the issue," she continued. "You treat politics like a playground. You believe mocking children is a tactic. But families deserve more than to be used as your props. Leadership doesn't mean turning kids into weapons. It means giving them dignity. The energy in the room changed again. People leaned forward, straining to hear her over the rustle of papers and faint hum of cameras. Staffers who had been scribbling notes stopped mid-sentence, their pens frozen above the page. Even the chairman, gavel poised in his hand, held back, sensing that something larger was unfolding than routine committee theatrics. Trump's instinct was to reclaim control. He pushed forward, voice rising, the humor drained from his tone. "That's nonsense," he barked, louder this time, desperate to steady himself. "Don't bring my family into this." But his words landed weakly, out of rhythm, because the spotlight had already shifted. Crockett had taken it, and she wasn't letting go. The cameras locked on her as she sat upright, shoulders squared, gaze unflinching. The room wasn't listening to Trump anymore. They were waiting for her, and she delivered. She slowed her cadence, letting silence punctuate each point, ensuring the weight of her argument reached every corner of the chamber. "You think humiliating families makes you strong," she told him evenly. "But strength doesn't come from tearing down children. Strength means protecting them. Every parent in this country understands that, even if you don't." The impact was electric. It wasn't just a rebuttal anymore. It was a moral rebuke. It reframed the debate in an instant, transforming Trump's attack into an indictment of his entire style of politics. Nervous chuckles rose from one side of the room, hushed quickly by the realization of where they were. A few claps escaped before hands were pulled back, the audience aware of the gravity of what they were witnessing. Trump tried again, his voice laced with irritation. "You're twisting my words," he snapped. "Nobody is dragging kids into this but you." His fingers gripped the microphone tightly, his jaw stiff. But Crockett didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, calm and razor sharp. "Your words, Mr. Trump," she counted. "You told us to deport our so-called illegal kids. That's what you said. And if that's your idea of strength, then maybe you need to be reminded what true leadership looks like. Because leadership isn't about mocking families. It's about standing up for them." The chamber rippled again. Members of the committee exchanged glances. Some of Trump's loyalists folded their arms, glaring in silence. Others shifted forward, captivated, unwilling to miss a word. From the press gallery came the faint scratch of hurried notes, punctuated by one reporter whispering to another, "This is going to be everywhere in an hour." Trump pointed a finger at her, his voice rising with anger. "Don't you dare talk about my family," he thundered. But Crockett didn't retreat. Instead, she softened her tone, almost as though she were explaining a lesson to someone who had never learned it. "This isn't about your family," she replied, steady as stone. "It's about respect. It's about decency. Because when you make children the punchline of your politics, you're telling every parent in this country that their kids don't matter, that their dignity doesn't matter. And that is not only wrong, it's dangerous." The silence that followed was louder than any shout. Phones glowed as staffers fired off urgent updates. Reporters sent live feeds streaming out of the chamber. Even the chairman leaned back in his chair, recognizing that the moment needed space to breathe. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pounded the desk, but the clarity of her words held the room hostage. Behind her, aides and citizens who had been invited to watch sat still, eyes fixed on her with pride etched across their faces. They seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing something that would echo far beyond those four walls. Trump tried again, this time raising his volume to near shouting. "You're lying. You Democrats are always lying. You want open borders. You don't care about America." His frustration spilled over in a way that felt more desperate than commanding. Yet Crockett still refused to meet him at that volume. She let the noise burn itself out, waited a beat, then delivered her next words like a hammer. "You want to talk about lies?" she said. "Then explain to the American people why you pretend to fight for families, when the very first thing you do is use them as targets. That's not strength, that's weakness. And deep down, everybody in this room knows it." The murmur that followed was unmistakable. This wasn't the typical back and forth sparring that filled countless hearings. This was different. Her words cut deeper, framing the debate not as a partisan fight, but as a question of character. If Crockett had ended there, she would have already secured the viral clip, the headlines, the sound bite replayed across every screen in America. But she didn't stop. She shifted in her chair, leaned closer to the microphone, and continued with a conviction that carried far beyond that chamber. "This is why the American people are tired of your double standards," she said firmly. When you treat children like bargaining chips, you tell every mother and father that their love doesn't matter, that their dignity doesn't matter. And that is not leadership. It is cruelty. The weight in her tone was unmistakable. It wasn't just sharpness. It was layered with the story she carried into that room. Families back home in Texas. Parents who worked themselves to exhaustion just to provide for their children. Teenagers who had grown up in this country, only to be told they didn't belong. She gave voice to all of them in that moment. Trump tried to interrupt, insisting, "You don't know what you're talking about." But Crockett's reply was immediate, precise. "I know because I've sat with them," she said. "I've met the parents who work double shifts and still worry every night if your policies will rip their children away. I've listened to teenagers who wonder why they're treated like criminals when all they've ever done is dream of a future here. Those are the people you mock when you talk about illegal kids. Those are the families you belittle when you turn their lives into punchlines." The chamber stirred again. At that point, it wasn't clear if Crockett was still speaking directly to Trump or to the millions of viewers who would see the footage later. She wasn't just countering him anymore. She was reframing the entire debate. Trump's face flushed red, his grip on the microphone tightening. He shot back, "Nobody's done more for families than I have." But Crockett's response landed like a final strike. She leaned in, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. "Then show us. Show this country what decency looks like, because right now, all the American people see is a man who uses children as the butt of his jokes. That's not leadership. That's not patriotism. That's weakness disguised as strength." Reporters were already pushing out updates, timelines lighting up within minutes. Staffers whispered frantically into phones. The hearing, meant to be another day of political theater, had become something else entirely, a turning point. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just countered Trump's attack. She had seized it, reshaped it, and turned it into an indictment of his entire approach to politics. And as the silence deepened, one truth settled across the chamber. Trump's usual arsenal of insults had finally met its match, not in shouting, not in bluster, but in the calm, unshakable voice of someone who refused to let cruelty pass unchallenged. She hadn't just responded to his insult. She had taken it apart piece by piece and turned it back on him like a mirror, leaving him to sit in silence while the entire country watched. What made the exchange unforgettable wasn't confined to the walls of the chamber. It was how quickly it detonated in the world outside. Before most lawmakers had even left their seats, the internet was already ablaze. Journalists who had been live tweeting the hearing uploaded shaky clips straight from their phones, and those raw recordings spread like wildfire across social media. Within minutes, Jasmine Crockett's words were ricocheting from Twitter feeds to Facebook timelines and into endless TikTok loops. The footage wasn't polished. It wasn't staged. And that was exactly why it carried so much force. You could hear the audible gasps, see Trump's startled reaction, and watch Crockett deliver her rebuke with a calmness that cut sharper than any raised voice ever could. What gave the moment staying power wasn't the clash itself, but the sense of moral certainty behind her words. People weren't only sharing the video because it was shocking. They were sharing it because it carried a universal message. Children should never be treated as pawns in adult battles. Even celebrities jumped in. An actor reposted the clip with the caption, "Decency isn't partisan." A chart-topping singer tweeted, "Protect kids. Period." Respect to Jasmine Crockett. Once pop culture figures started echoing her, the moment expanded from politics into cultural territory. Trump's team scrambled for damage control. His spokesperson issued a statement accusing Crockett of being disrespectful and crossing a line. But that attempt to reframe the narrative only extended its lifespan in the news cycle. Late-night shows pounced immediately. Stephen Colbert replayed her remarks, then joked, "Trump finally met someone fluent in Trump, and he hated it." The audience erupted. Jimmy Kimmel quipped, "Imagine being roasted so badly in Congress your own cheerleaders stop clapping." For Crockett, however, it wasn't about comedy or viral fame. The following morning, when reporters gathered outside her office, she delivered a short and simple line. "This isn't about politics. It's about dignity. Every child deserves respect." That single statement repeated across outlets almost as frequently as the clip itself. It reinforced that her stand wasn't just a quip, it was principle. The virality sparked deeper conversations. Podcasts debated it. Radio hosts analyzed it. Families discussed it at dinner. Was this the new model for confronting Trump? Meeting his mockery with clarity that exposed the cruelty beneath? Many believed so. What no one could deny was that Crockett's stature had transformed overnight. She wasn't merely a freshman congresswoman anymore. She had become a national figure, a face of moral pushback against Trumpism. Crockett herself avoided grandstanding. She didn't flood networks with interviews or victory laps. Instead, she entered the Capitol calmly, answered a handful of questions with brief replies, and left the cameras hungry. Asked if she regretted mentioning Trump's son, she shook her head. No regrets. He set the terms. I just reminded him what they meant. That answer, too, made headlines. Trump, on the other hand, was clearly rattled. He retreated to his golf club, venting to aides about unfair treatment. His Truth social feed exploded with capitalized rants. Jasmine Crockett is a disgrace, and she attacked my family. Unheard of. Loyalists applauded, but outside his echo chamber, those posts only drew more notice to the fact that Crockett had hit a nerve. His advisors debated strategy. Ignore it and move on, or hit back harder. Ultimately, Trump couldn't let it go. He doubled down in speeches, calling Crockett radical and vicious, but in doing so, he ensured another round of coverage. Meanwhile, Crockett's allies leaned in. The Congressional Black Caucus praised her composure. Progressive organizations clipped her remarks into ads about family dignity. Even centrist Democrats, who often distanced themselves from fiery moments, amplified her words, sensing that she had touched a nerve that crossed political lines. In a small-town diner, the tension around the conversation was so strong you could almost taste it. One older gentleman slammed his coffee cup down so hard the counter rattled and muttered, "You don't involve someone's child. That's just off limits." But another patron, sitting a few seats away, pushed back immediately. Trump opened that door himself. He made it about children first. She only turned his words right back on him. A waitress, balancing plates of eggs and toast as she passed, tossed in her 2 cents. If he didn't keep picking fights, maybe he wouldn't keep ending up roasted online. The discussion reflected a broader wave sweeping across the country. Reactions from people who usually didn't weigh in on politics. A nurse in Arizona posted on social media, "I don't care what party you belong to. Mocking children is wrong." Crockett was right to call it out. A construction worker in Florida added on Facebook, "I don't even follow politics much," but she put him in his place the right way. Yet at the same time, Trump's most loyal defenders were livid. Conservative influencers rushed to denounce her, insisting she crossed an unspoken line. Even so, some voices inside those circles admitted the obvious. A Tennessee talk radio host, a longtime Trump supporter, conceded on air, "Listen, I'm a fan of the man, but let's be real. He dragged kids into it first. You can't act shocked when someone tosses it back at you." Even religious leaders entered the conversation. At a church in Detroit, a pastor referenced the clip during Sunday service. Words carry weight. When leaders use them to tear down children, that isn't strength, it's cruelty. But when truth is spoken calmly and firmly, that's courage we can all learn from. His congregation nodded, some even murmuring affirmations. The clip reached sports radio as well. In St. Louis, 2 local hosts spent a halftime break dissecting the exchange instead of the game. One laughed, "Forget the Cardinals. Did you catch Crockett torch Trump?" His co-host chimed in, "Man, that's the first time I've seen him at a loss for words." That's news all by itself. As pundits and commentators picked apart the viral clip, its deeper significance became clear. This wasn't another routine spat destined to fade by next week. It struck a chord because it forced Americans to confront something larger: the values we choose to tolerate in our leaders. For years, Trump thrived on shredding boundaries, mocking opponents, belittling journalists, coining nicknames that stuck like glue. But when he extended that style to families, suggesting children of immigrants should be deported, he touched a nerve that felt too personal. Crockett's reply mattered because it wasn't just about clapping back. It was about reestablishing a line many Americans believed had been erased. Editorial pages quickly picked up this theme. The Boston Globe ran the headline, "Crockett shows why children must be off limits." The Dallas Morning News called it a return to decency. In the Washington Post, a columnist wrote, "By holding steady with calm clarity, Crockett reminded us that strength is rooted in dignity, not cruelty." Even some conservative commentators, while critical of her mentioning Barron, admitted the bigger message landed. One right-leaning radio personality summed it up, "I didn't like her dragging his kid in. But she's right. Politics should be about issues, not children." Trump lit that fire, and she finished it. Families across the country echoed the same sentiment. In Bakersfield, a mother explained to her teenage daughter why she admired Crockett's restraint. See? You don't need to scream to stand up for yourself. The right words, said calmly, carry more weight than shouting ever could. In Minneapolis, a father told his son, what she showed is that kids should always be off the table. Doesn't matter whose kids they are. The confrontation also exposed Trump's double standard. For years, he had dished out insults freely, often without consequence. But when Crockett mirrored his tactic, suddenly his camp cried foul. That contradiction wasn't lost on viewers. It highlighted the imbalance of fairness in public discourse. When he mocks, it's branded strong, but when someone reflects it back, it becomes too far. Crockett's moment sparked a larger conversation about empathy and leadership in an era where politics had grown increasingly harsh. She didn't frame her remarks as a policy argument filled with statistics. She spoke about children, families, and dignity, values that transcend party labels. Her words reminded many of historic flashpoints where moral clarity cut through political noise, like Joseph Welch's famous question to Senator McCarthy, have you no sense of decency? Not everyone agreed with those comparisons, of course. Some said she crossed her own line by referencing Trump's son. Others argued that without holding up that mirror, Trump's words would have slipped by as just another jab. The discomfort was intentional. It forced attention. And in homes, classrooms, and churches, the lesson repeated itself. Words matter. Dignity matters. Leadership matters. In the end, Crockett's exchange wasn't about who scored the sharpest insult. It was about resetting expectations for public life. Her response stood as a reminder that strength isn't measured in volume or bravado, but in conviction and timing. Parents watching recognized the instinct to protect their children. Students who had ever felt targeted knew the sting she was addressing. She transformed a partisan fight into a universal moment. The public takeaway was unmistakable. The politics we tolerate define the politics we live with. If insults toward children are excused, respect in public life sinks even lower. But if moments like Crockett's are amplified, moments where dignity is defended and hypocrisy is exposed, then perhaps politics can inch back toward decency. History often pivots on brief sentences spoken in tense rooms. Crockett's was one of those sentences. She didn't seek the spotlight. She simply refused to let cruelty go unanswered. And in doing so, she reminded the country that dignity still has power.